we come across decolonizing Indian history, rhetoric or reality? That's the question. Well, we have a very eminent panel with us to talk about this. Khan Mahmudabad joining us online, teaches political science and history at Ashoka University and is a national spokesperson for the Samajwadi Party. Welcome, Khan Mahmudabad. We have with us, ladies and gentlemen, J Sai Deepak, who's an engineer turned litigator, practicing as an arguing counsel primarily before the Supreme Court of India and the High Court of Delhi. Ladies and gentlemen, let's welcome J Sai Deepak. We have with us Mrs. Meenakshi Jain, who's a senior fellow of the Indian Council of Social India Research. Her areas of research include cultural and religious developments in medieval and early modern India. Ma'am Meenakshi Jain, welcome to the stage of Arth, a culture fest, celebrating 75 years of Azadi Ka Amrit Mahotsav. In conversation with the dignitaries, we have a very, very acclaimed public intellectual who's written more than 300 columns for Swarajya, First Post, News Laundry, and DNA. He's also the consulting editor of Swarajya. We have with us Anand Ranganathan. Ladies and gentlemen, let's welcome Anand on stage to be in conversation with the dignitaries to talk about decolonizing Indian history, rhetoric, or reality.
Hi, good evening, everyone, and thanks very much for a very kind introduction. It's a real pleasure and an honor to be moderating this, what promises to be a wonderful discussion. Meenakshi Ji, welcome to the discussion, and J Sai, of course, it's absolutely wonderful to see you again. The only problem I have with you is you seem to be getting thinner day by day, which is, or fitter rather, which is a problem. And I'm also, it's a great pleasure to welcome our my third fellow panelist. I can't see him very clearly. Hi, Dr. Ali Hai from Lucknow. He's joining us online. So I thought before I start bombarding my fellow panelists with questions regarding this discussion, I thought I'll give them a couple of minutes each to let us know what they really feel about this topic, which is decolonizing Indian history. Is it really all rhetoric that we've been talking about since 2014 that we need to decolonize it, or have we seen some reality? Where do we stand as far as this topic is concerned? So can I please start with Meenakshi Ji and then follow with J Sai and then Ali. Thank you.
Yeah. Decolonizing Indian history. It's not all rhetoric. A lot still remains to be done, but certain significant steps have been taken. They have not been taken by any government body or organization or institution. What has happened in the last decade is that a couple of independent scholars have written major books that have contributed to decolonizing the Indian narrative. Books by J Sai Deepak, Vikram Sampath, and others, and I may also include myself in that. And these books, they're also important because they have not been popularized through government channels. Social media, the internet, has played a very, very important role in popularizing these works. So avenues which are state-sponsored still remain closed. A lot of the work of rewriting Indian history remains to be done, but certain important steps have been taken by individuals in their independent capacity.
So you feel that we have a little bit of reality, or is it not
yes.
all?
No, reality is very much there.
Okay, so out of 100, how much is rhetoric and how much is reality?
Reality is about 30%.
30%. Okay. J Sai?
So let me start by first of all.
I think you're...
Yeah. So let me first of all start by thanking the organizers for giving me an opportunity to share a space with a living legend such as Dr. Meenakshi Jain, and who's a Padma awardee at this point. And congratulations to you, ma'am. I think among the few things that the government has got right, this has to be one of them. Finally recognizing people whose recognition has been long due. So to build on what Dr. Jain has just presented, the fact that there is not much government support in this particular department is proof of the fact that it is more about reality than rhetoric. Although it's not an intended consequence, that is the unintended consequence of lack of state support. That's one. And what it also indicates, according to me, is that the society is tired of waiting for the state to take cognizance of this particular issue and is therefore saying, well, we will produce our own scholars. And let the scholars subject themselves to the scrutiny of the larger audience, as well as to the guardians of scholarship. And to a significant extent, I would believe that the Indic stream of thought has managed to prove itself on the annals of both scholarship as well as large-scale public acceptance. So it's not as if people have dumbed down facts and scholarship to be able to reach out to a wider audience, nor have they chosen to limit themselves to the ivory towers of academia. So there's a fantastic balance that they have struck between scholarship and, let's say, mass outreach, so to speak. So that's point number 2. Point number 3, I think the fundamental question, which keeps coming back over and over again, is why is history such a battleground? Well, because history continues to feature in all our current day discussions on every aspect of policy. And second, why is decolonizing history so important? Because there is a recognition across the board. Of course, there are still certain islands which continue to believe that they are the sole guardians of this and who believe that all of that is happening is merely revisionism. This is not revisionism. And nobody is rewriting something by manufacturing something. The best part of what we have all learned from giants such as Dr. Jain and others is that you go to the primary source as much as possible. You build it on the basis of credible citations, just as any other engineer or a scientific professional would do in the realm of science. So while you can't compare history and arts with the science in entirety, the rigor in that approach can be replicated here to try and prove as much as possible through facts. A popular mythologist has made a distinction, although I disagree with him on almost everything else. The distinction between facts and truth is something that I certainly believe in, which is to say, you present the facts as much as possible. The entire picture that emerges by way of reality or truth, that's for the readers to understand and assimilate. So in that particular department, I believe that decolonizing Indian history is extremely crucial because we are currently living in an age of weaponizing a certain notion or version of history, which is coming back to haunt this particular civilization's independent and native consciousness. So according to me, this is not the pastime of the well-fed. This, according to me, is not, let's say, the pet peeve of the wine-tasting elites of Lutyens. According to me, this is a critical civilizational imperative. And the best part is, most of the current crop of, let's say, academics and scholars, such as Dr. Vikram Sampath and others who have come about, are practitioners of this particular subject who have made a conscious switch to this particular stream from diverse streams such as engineering. And we all come from very normal, humble backgrounds, as much as possible. So it's not as if there is someone behind us to basically say, beta jaake kuch bhi kar lo, main hu piche. So nobody has the luxury of dabbling in a certain profession which does not exactly have a fantastic return on investment. Clearly that shows that the society has awakened. So there are two aspects. The society has started producing options in terms of scholarship which are stellar. And two, it is also willing to consume it, critique it, criticize it, and build on it. So our success, according to me, is not just a function of our individual talents. It is a function of the society being ready to consume this. Just as the society has produced a Narendra Modi, it has also produced a Vikram Sampath, it is also producing Dr. Jain, it has produced public intellectuals such as you. So I think it's a reflection of the times that we live in. And the dying need, the society is basically saying, we need alternative versions and alternative voices. I think that's what we represent.
Wonderfully put, but as I asked the same question to Meenakshi, I ask it to you as well. Out of 100, how much do you think is right now at present reality and rhetoric?
Perhaps I'm slightly more optimistic in my opinion, simply because Dr. Jain has seen, let's say, a much more morbid past in terms of how people have been treated. Yeah. And therefore, I have the luxury of being much more optimistic. And I believe that we are at least 60% real, right, and there's about 40% rhetoric. Right. The rhetoric typically is in the realm of those people who are trying to use it for certain gains. But the reality, according to me, is 100% on the part of those who are trying to actually work on it from the point of view of depth, vision, and scholarship. So I would say, on the academic front, it's at the very least 70 to 80% real and maybe 20% academic. But those who are outside of it and who want to see something come out of it for other uses, so to speak, political uses, so to speak, perhaps the split there is 50-50.
So that's very encouraging. I mean, I'll hold on to those thoughts. I'll come back to that.
Right.
This split between rhetoric and reality. And I'll also ask you whether that percentage or split has changed since 2014, has it improved or not. But can I please again welcome Dr. Ali Khan. Your views, please, before we move on to other questions.
Thank you very much for having me on the panel, and I apologize in advance because I'm in rural UP and electricity supply is not a constant here. I would begin with this. Decolonization as a process, of course, is very important. Who does it? Well, hopefully people who've been trained enough in the methodologies of history and other social science disciplines. But the more important point I want to ask is decolonization towards what end, right? Initially, when countries undergo a process of decolonization, often it is embedded within a struggle for freedom, and the first goal is self-determination. Once you reach that goal, then you come out of that and you try and build a character, a consciousness that tries to strip away ideas, concepts, identities that have been foisted upon you. So the point is then, where do you start, right? And of course, you have to differentiate between colonization as a process, which is linked to the nation state and so on, and the great colonizing powers, and of course, imperial history and the empires, pre-modern empires. Those are two separate things in my opinion, and it's important to remember those. A very simple way of understanding this is as follows. Actually, language, as Ngugi wa Thiong'o, the great Kenyan writer, says, is not just a means of communication; it is a carrier of culture. And one of the things we have to understand is the words that we use. For example, the word Hindu, the word Muslim, what we mean by Islam, what we mean by Hinduism. Or indeed, what, for example, take a slightly neutral word like childhood, right? These words and their meanings change over the course of centuries. These words do not have stable meanings. A very base. I mean, if you go as my right honorable friend Dr. Sai was saying just now, if you go to the primary sources in the 19th century, in the 18th century, there will be a very different idea of what it means to be Hindu. There might be beliefs that are core to Hinduism. There might be beliefs that are core to Islam. But what it means practically to be a Muslim or to be a Hindu changes. In terms of ritual practice today, 100 years ago, many Muslims, many Hindus would not be seen as Hindu or Muslim enough by people 100 years ago. Words change their meaning, contexts change, and therefore the process of decolonization is to excavate the past with a view of reaffirming our humanity, right? Another famous metaphor that Ngugi uses is that our lives are a battlefield, and they are a battlefield of a continuous war between forces that are pledged to affirm our humanity and those determined to dismantle it. And so the biggest problem with decolonization only arises when the state actually begins to interfere and begins to put decolonization towards a political process, because then you are trying to, I saw one of the tweets that I think the Arth Festival made, and they used the word pure, decolonization, so that we can unveil what is pure. Now, the whole idea of purity or authenticity in the social sciences, and particularly in history, is a very dangerous concept, because it shows an arrogance that you have a rigorous enough understanding of the past, a clear enough understanding of the past to say that this is the authentic way of being. And of course, the other reason that it is dangerous is because you become static, you become stagnant. I think the greatness of Indic civilization, and India in particular, is that it has remained a confluence of civilizations. The process of decolonization particularly relates, in my mind, to the period in which the British occupied this country, and essentially through the mechanisms and processes of a nation state, and the wherewithal of bureaucracy foisted identity upon us. And therefore, it is very important to go back to the past and to try and disentangle the past, but not towards towards an end of affirming a form of purity or authenticity. I'm reminded of a Urdu couplet by Majaz, who's a poet from Lucknow, from Rudoli. He says, "Khud dil mein reh ke aankh se parda kare koi, haan lutf ye ke pa ke bhi dhoonda kare koi." So the one who lives in my heart, Bhagwan, Allah, Ishwar, is veiled from my eyes. Verily, the joy is in continuing to seek once you have found, right? This contradiction, this is the dialectic that moves history forward, and any process of decolonization that simply wants to set up and go back to a golden age or a past and to present an authentic, pure version of it is going to result in a form of intellectual stagnancy, social stagnancy, and eventually also political stagnancy.
And if I may ask the same question that I've asked the other panelists, at present, how much out of 100 do you think is occupied by reality and how much by rhetoric when it comes to decolonization?
So I would beg your leave not to put a number on that, because one of the fields of decolonization, in my opinion, is literature. And literature doesn't really work very well with numbers. It is the stories we tell and the manner in which we tell them. If you see Africa, if you see South Asia as a whole, if you see Latin America, the pioneers of decolonization are actually not those who are rewriting history, but those who are writing good literature and who are reclaiming language and preserving language. So with due respect to your question, I wouldn't have an answer to it.
Like a true political scientist. No, but you've actually, you did harp upon a couple of very interesting points, and I'm going to add those to the discussion. I think one of the things that you said was that the meaning of words itself has changed throughout, well, you said throughout history, or maybe you meant centuries, or you talked about some examples of what is it to be a Hindu, what is it to be a Muslim, maybe hundreds of years ago. So I will go across my fellow panelists to ask them, because as a scientist, that is worrying to me, because I am not a man of gray, to be honest with you. I like things black and white. And history, as many people say, is to be interpreted. If you are in the contemporary scenario, then you will interpret it differently, as what Dr. Ali seems to be saying, suggesting that if words, the meanings of words has changed, then obviously the book that is written now, or you interpreting the events of 200 years ago, you will have different eyes. That sounds very interesting to me, especially because in science, the interpretation can change, but the facts are irrevocable. For example, if the B form of DNA double helix in 1953 was, or the B form of DNA was double helical in 1953, it is going to remain double helical in 2,900 whatever, or millions of years from now. It's not going to change. You can talk about it differently, you can use different words to describe the double helix, but it will remain a double helix. But what immediately came to my mind, Ali, was that nowadays we're having this great debate on hijab, and you know, the whole nation seems to be worked up on it. And there was a photo that was circulating of Muhammad Ali Jinnah. He is sitting and he's surrounded by at least 100 women from the Muslim League, and none of them are wearing the hijab. Now, you would expect someone who harped back to the golden era of you know, Islam, and in fact decapitated India to get a country out of it. You would have expected him, of course, now we know later on that he hid that he used to eat pork and he used to drink alcohol, but what I meant was, at least to the people who surrounded him, you would have expected Jinnah to ask them to adhere to this so-called Quranic code, but none of them didn't, and he didn't seem to really mind. So this question, let me start with you, Ali, and then I'll move on to others. Is it good or is it bad for the society that you are interpreting what has been set in stone differently throughout centuries?
So look, this is a very good question. Thank you for the question. I think it is inevitable that we are the lens through which we see the past, i.e. the present, is going to affect how we see it. For every photo there might be of Jinnah surrounded by women without hijab. There are photos of our Prime Minister surrounded by people with hijab. These are people's individual choices. Of course, the reason why people wear the hijab and the form even that the hijab takes, Sayyid Hussain Nasr, who's a great scholar of Islam, writes about this, has changed. It has changed over the last 120 years. It has changed because of social changes, economic changes, colonialism, globalization, right? The very fact that people in Africa and South Asia are now have easy access through Facebook to the Middle East, right? The world has changed. So we cannot lament or undo that change. As far as Pakistan is concerned, I think actually the nail on the head, because whether it's Jinnah, whether it's Savarkar, who I'm sure most of the audience are familiar with, is an ideologue of Hindutva. So using Hinduism politically, Jinnah is trying to use Islam politically. Or if you take a person like Theodor Herzl, who is one of the kind of ideological progenitors or a godfather, if you like, in simple words, of Zionism. All of these three men were atheists or agnostic, self-affirmed, right? They were simply trying to mold religion into what they saw was most needed at that time, which was a form of nationalism, right? Each of them had very little time for what is called ritual Hinduism, ritual Islam. Theodor Herzl writes about how the rabbis should stay in the temples. So, the fact, and therefore the creation of Pakistan itself is a very interesting field to look at. And this will be my last point. Sorry for taking some time. Because in a sense, it is a process of decolonization, or the idea that they were somehow going back to an Islamically authentic past. That idea animated the creation of Pakistan, right? That catalyzed the creation of Pakistan. Once Pakistan is created, what happens? No one can define what Islam is, and no one can define what a Muslim is. They are killing each other. They're fighting amongst each other. There's fatwas of takfir against communities. So it's a case in point for not using religion and not having a political goal in the process of decolonization. Because what ends up happening then is you're simply using an idea to capture power. So for instance, tomorrow, right, if 200 or 180 million Muslims from India were to disappear overnight, Saeed Naqvi has written a very interesting play recently about this. It's an interesting thought experiment, because what would happen then, right? One potential scenario is that there would be a fight about who is Hindu enough and what it means to be Hindu and who defines Hinduism, and various strands would emerge. So this process of decolonization has to be a process that is undertaken by society. There must be multiple strands. Each strand will present an alternative view, but it is not the state's job to arbitrate between these. I think it becomes very dangerous when the state begins to take a call on what is correct history, what is incorrect history, because fundamentally the state is now concerned with the future and with governance and the well-being. And as I quoted, the Kenyan writer Ngugi wa Thiong'o, it is about confirming the humanity of individuals who are alive today. So that would be my response to your question.
Interesting. In fact, hold on to that, Ali, because I'm going to come back to that. And I want to bring Dr. Meenakshi in, because a couple of things that Ali has said may be in the larger scenario seem to be a little bit problematic as we move forward, as nations move forward. And the reason I say that is, and I come back to the title of this discussion itself, Ali, and I'll bring you in after I bring Dr. Meenakshi in, because when we talk of decolonization, it is a fact that Jinnah was, of course, and we look back and we read, as we know more and more about the history of himself that he hid from the world, including the fact that he knew he's going to die in 8 months' time of tuberculosis. But the fact he was not really a theologian, he was a politician. And he won, I would say, because he was a politician. I think the British understood that, and they were scared of that. But the fact is, decolonization, so you can say in one aspect, he decolonized that part of India that broke away to Pakistan, and he got it. But was he able to decolonize the Pakistanis, I'm talking of the last 70 years, from the fact that they have been colonized by religious fanaticism, if you can say it, because what Ali says is true only to the extent that it was the process, Ali was, I put to you, was irreversible. I mean, when Zia brought in the Hudud ordinances, Pakistan was already quite advanced. It was already 30 years down, so you can say nations are advancing, they're becoming more civilized. But in fact, he harked back to, 1,000 years. And now that process is now irreversible. And we know it for a fact. Pakistan is not going to progress. It has been shackled. So when we talk, Dr. Jain, of decolonization, do we not misunderstand it most times that we meaning to be, it's a political end or it's like an empire? That thought process has been decolonized, and we are afraid to really, address the elephant in the room, which is religion or Islam itself.
Absolutely. One or two important points that you have raised. I want to say that, this notion that has been put forward by Mr. Ali, that Hindu identity, Muslim identity went on changing with the time. As a student of history, I cannot agree with that. Right from the time of the advent of Islam into the subcontinent, this religious factor was operative. And in the minds of the Arabs and Turks who came to India, they were very clear that the rest of the people are kafirs. And they have to be treated differently. They have to be paying the jizya. They have to be given minimal representation in government. Their sacred sites and sacred structures do not have to be respected. They have to be vandalized. So much so that in the entire North India, in the 18th century, there was hardly a standing temple left. So the entire North India, what we see Banaras today, is a recreation of by the Marathas in the 18th century. So to say that there was no sense of Hindu identity or no sense of Muslim identity, it does not go with the facts of history as I have understood them. So, all the rulers of the Sultanate period and the Mughal period, with the exception of one or two, they indulged in wanton destruction of temples. So it is, and why, if there was no sense of a Muslim identity, and if they did not have a view of the other, the kafir, then why would they indulge in all this? And second point that I want to make is that when Muslim empire or the Mughal empire was in decline, and there was the rise of the Marathas as a very important political force in North India, the leading ulema of Delhi, Shah Wali Ullah, he was frightened at the prospect of a non-Muslim power in Delhi, and he actually wrote 7 letters to the Afghan ruler Ahmad Shah Abdali, and those letters have survived. And he said that if you do not come, then your brethren, there will be you will not hear the call of Azan, so you please come to defend the faith. So this idea of the faith, it was always present in the mind of the people. And to say that it was not present, and in the entire period, all the religious and social reform movements that occurred in the Islamic community, they had one advice to give to their followers. And that was that, many of them were converts. So their advice was, kindly give up every practice that you followed before you became Muslim. So no conduct of yours should have any similarity with that of a Hindu. So, the entire medieval period speaks of this. You cannot you cannot observe certain festivals, you cannot dress like this, you cannot. So the entire thing, and just to give one more example, Akbar is hailed as the best example of a Muslim ruler. But not many people know that one of the most important innovations that Akbar did was that in that period, he ordained that Persian will be the language of administration at all levels. So that even the village Patwari had to learn Persian. And how do you learn Persian immediately? So he revised the madrasa curriculum so that large number of Hindus can enter the madrasas and learn Persian. So, as mature people, we should recognize that there were certain fault lines that were there in our history from the 7th century onwards. Unfortunately, those fault lines have not disappeared, and in many cases they have accentuated. No religious reform movement or social reform movement in Islam from the 18th, 19th century said reduce the barriers. It said strengthen the barriers. Strengthen your Muslim identity. Discard any kafir practice that you may be unwittingly following. So, you know, there are so many leaders of the Muslim period, I mean religious reform leaders who said that don't follow this. And the whole thing was to make Islam as conservative as possible. In the 18th and 19th century, every reform movement wanted to strengthen the conservative trend in Islam.
But do we not see, I mean, before I come to J Sai, just a supplementary short thing. I mentioned about that photograph of Jinnah with 100 women.
Yes.
They are all wearing saris. None of them is wearing a burqa or a hijab. So when you say, you talk of those times and you're talking about the whole idea was to become more and more conservative.
Yes.
We don't really see that. I mean, of course, in East Pakistan, still we see a lot of Muslim, in fact, most Muslim women wearing saris and not, but in those times, none of them were wearing burqas or hijab or something. So this political transformation of going back or becoming more and more conservative was certainly not 100 years old, is it? Or
no, it's possible. I have not seen the burqa thing, but I've read the teachings of the religious leaders, and they all said, become more and more conservative in your behavior.
Right. Ali, yes, I see you raising your hand. In fact, if you disagree with Dr. Jain, I will give you ample opportunity to rebut, and I want you to rebut. We want it to be as controversial a debate as possible. Well, in a nice jovial manner. But now I come to Sai because I have, the question I wanted to ask you, Sai, I have actually, through the passages of Ali and Dr. Jain talking about this thing, I've added a couple of things to it. And the real crux, the nub of the issue I want to ask you is that, is it not true that being politically correct is the death of being rational and talking about one's own history? So if you are politically correct, you destroy a kind of any project that would be to unshackle or to decolonize. And I say that when we were taking the examples of Jinnah or, you know, his contemporaries, I mean, Ambedkar was one contemporary. We hardly, it's only in the last 7 or 8 years that we've come to know about his views of Islam. I mean, if there was one person who was not politically correct, it was Ambedkar. And I'm sure if, you know, if there were as much ire for, or punishment, demand for punishment for blasphemy, he would have been the first one to be beheaded for his views. I mean, they're really incredible to that level. So that is question number one. How much do you bemoan this increasing political correctness? Let's not talk about this. Let's you know, this may interfere in the unity or amity of the country. And I really want to bring in our Prime Minister as well, because two of his celebratory tweets over the past 2 months have really irked me. One was his celebrating Saint Xavier, who was the architect of the Goan Inquisition. I mean, where small Hindu women, children, they were butchered and they were converted, and Jews, yes. And the second was, I think, Chishti, when he venerated him, ignoring the kind of ruthlessness of not only of Chishti, but also of a lot of Sufi kings, including the one in Kashmir. So, I mean, when our own Prime Minister is indulging in this political correctness, I'm assuming he's not ignorant of the crimes of the Sufis and of Saint Xavier. Then who are we to talk about that, you know, let us have the common man to improve and open their eyes when the Prime Minister himself is indulging in this?
So I have a response to what Dr. Ali said, and I'll build on what Dr. Jain has submitted. And here's a spoiler alert. I've just completed 50% of my second book, and it traces all the connections starting from the movement of Shah Waliullah Dehlavi, whose father Abdur Rahim was one of the compilers of Fatwa Alamgiri under Aurangzeb, and who founded what is known as Madrasa Rahimia in Delhi. From there until Sayyid Ahmad Khan, what is the connection is what 50,000 words is what I've spent in the book right now, 3 chapters. Effectively capturing this entire journey. I'll just come to that in a minute. Let's start from your point. The fact that the country's head could perhaps take a a slightly more lenient and accommodative approach towards those who've been brutal and ruthless and cruel to the native identity or the native culture, let's not call it identity, native consciousness, so to speak, also reflects why history should start with the society as opposed to the state. This is where perhaps, where Dr. Jain and Dr. Ali meet. He started off by making the submission that the moment the state becomes the repository and the prime mover of the act of decolonization, you obviously are moving towards a political end, and therefore there is a certain degree of cutting corners with facts and logic, and therefore there is an agenda that's being pushed.
And let's be honest, the Indian state has.
That's exactly what I was coming to. So what Indian decolonization of history is actually doing is to take it back from the state, simply because for the last 70 years, a specific dispensation with a very specific bent of mind, which is the Nehruvian Marxist dispensation, has pushed history in a certain direction, regardless of, and I mean without regard for history and facts. Therefore, the current response, so to speak, is from the society, and therefore it is truly more decolonial in that particular sense. Second, I think Dr. Ali, given his submissions, I'd say has been very intelligent in drawing a false symmetry between all religions and all thought processes, which I fundamentally disagree with. Therefore, his fundamental submission has been, Pakistan was founded on the basis of bringing back Islam in its purity and pristine form. That's exactly the language used by Shah Waliullah Dehlavi, by the way. And he had a problem with two people, Hindus as well as Shias. He makes it abundantly clear. When he writes letters to Abdali starting from 1757 onwards, when he sacked Mathura, he expresses satisfaction at the destruction of Mathura, but is unhappy with the sack of Delhi, because he lives there. And then once more when he writes in 1759, when the Marathas had almost gone to the northwest, and which is what led ultimately to the 1761 battle, what this gentleman does is identifies Kasbah by Kasbah, the localities where Hindus and Shias live in Delhi, and he writes both to Abdali as well as to Najib-ud-Dawla. Najib-ud-Dawla, he basically says, please collaborate with this gentleman, because all the nobilities of India have failed, which is to say, he writes to the Nizam, he writes to Turkey as usual, he writes to all of these people, none of them respond. This gentleman responds, or rather he doesn't respond to Abdali, he's coming here for his own purposes. He tells Najib-ud-Dawla, please guide the Abdali army to ensure that Muslim areas, and by that the Sunni areas, are not affected, so that we are spared this particular destruction. How his son Shah Abdul Aziz fundamentally takes that forward, and then his Shah Abdul Aziz's grandson, Shah Muhammad Ishaq Dehlavi, how he takes it forward. From there, how these movements start. You have Sayyid Shahid Ahmed Barelvi, who started the Wahhabi movement in India. Then in West Bengal, you had the Farezi movement under Haji Shariatullah, and then his son, Dudu Miah, he takes it up. All these movements and their connections, once you read it, it will bear out the fact that there has been absolutely no change in mentality. You start with the Wahhabi movement in the in the Middle East. Shah Waliullah Dehlavi and Abdul Wahhab were colleagues and contemporaries and students of Hadith in Hijaz. That's what history says. So both of them come back with the same ideas on purity and going back to Hadith. So therefore, what is the meaning? Islam shall be guided only by two pillars, Quran and Hadith. Any other accretion which is alien to these two sources must be weeded out as the fundamental position. Okay? And that fundamental position is taken forward. So after Barelvi, who passed away, were in Balakot. That's why Balakot is a training center for jihadis. He died on 6th of May 1831. He was killed by Prince Sher Singh, who was the son of Ranjit Singh. And please read this fantastic book by Aisha Jalal called Partisans of Allah. And there she starts by explaining why Balakot was so important, and that explains the reason why we attacked Balakot after the Pulwama attack. After that starts the LA Hadith movement. Then comes out LA Quran. Then starts Deoband in 1866. Then starts the Barelvi movement. Then you have Ahmadiyya movement around the same time. Okay? All of these movements, and then comes the Aligarh movement. Now I'll answer your question. Why is it that Jinnah is comfortable being surrounded by women who do not wear the hijab or the parda? Because Syed Ahmad Khan's biggest invention was his combination of pushing for Islamic ends within a European paradigm. Therefore, this gentleman visits England in 1869, comes back and then decides that I will set up this institution, where he too was a fan of the English ways and European ways. In his letters to
In fact, he decried the 1857 War of Independence.
No.
He called the people who fought the British as haramzadgi.
Exactly. So why? Until 1854, in his first book called Asarus Sanadid, which is his first book on the monuments of Delhi, he celebrates Dehlvi and Barelvi, both of whom were the forefathers of the Wahhabi movement until 1847, which is his first book. By 1847, what happens? Punjab is now in the hands of the English after the 1846 war, the Third Anglo-Sikh War. So then he starts changing his tune, and the portion where he celebrated the achievements of the Wahhabis, he has it removed by 1854. And then he starts preparing what is known as the defense of Islam, because by then, the Wahhabi movement had effectively made the entire Muslim community as disloyal in the eyes of the British. So that's when he starts his first book called The Causes of the Indian Revolt. It's called Asbab-e-Baghawat. That's the first book. And then he starts that. By 1870, he's effectively decided, the only way for me to survive in the modern era is to be able to liaise with the British, because thanks to the Hindus learning English, they had started occupying positions in the colonial establishment, while the traditional and conservative position of the Muslim institutions said we will never learn English, and therefore they stayed behind. He realized that if this were to continue, then Hindus would be back in positions of power, and the only way for this to change is for Indian Muslims to start learning English. That's why he set up what was previously known as the Muhammadan Anglo-Oriental College, which you know as the Aligarh Muslim University, in 1875. That explains why Jinnah was like this, because Muhammad Iqbal, Jinnah, all of these people were, let's say, they shared the thought process of Syed Ahmad Khan. Therefore, the outer look, so to speak, or the dressing, so to speak, could be modern or could be European. But the mentality hasn't changed and the mindset hasn't changed.
So this is where
Can I just make one
Okay,
addition?
quick one, yeah, before I get Ali in.
Yes. You know, Sai talked about Syed Ahmad Khan. So Syed Ahmad Khan, when he realized that the electoral principle is going to be introduced by the British, he told the British that we were the former rulers, so we should be given weightage according to our former position, not our numerical strength. And the Hindus, the lower caste, should be deprived of the vote so that we are at parity. So this was what he was advocating. And you know, he told, in Meerut, he addressed a meeting, and there he said, he advised the Muslims never to join the Congress. And he told the Congress and the British that supposing we do not get the status that we deserve, do not forget that across the border, our brother Pathans are there, and they will come at our calling and rivers of blood will flow. So, you know, he was the father of modern separatism, but that separatism tendency was there for a long time.
Correct. Right.
And I don't know why people think that he's the maker of modern India. He was not the maker of modern India, he was the disruptor of modern India.
Right, thank you. Ali, I saw your hand being raised quite a while ago, in fact, and so I'll give you ample opportunity to, if you disagree with what Dr. Jain said and what Sai said, but let me add a couple of things to this, because to make it even more interesting. One is, do you now agree that when we talk of decolonizing, we must perfunctorily also include decolonizing or deshackling from the diktats of centuries, maybe a millennia old, or the way our way of life has been conducted or ordained or commanded through religious diktats? Because that is one colonization that seems to be taking us back rather than taking us forward. Second question is, when you look at, let us say, when you read or write history, as I'm sure you do you, because of, I'm not trying to be patronizing at all, in fact, I would ask the same to Meenakshi Ji and J Sai as I'm asking you, and I will ask the same question to myself. Do we need to, or do we at all remove our lenses of religious predisposition or ideological predisposition? And if we don't, does that not cloud our reading and writing of history itself? I mean, the reason why I asked this is because when we were talking of, I think that Jinnah with that, with the women not wearing hijab, is, I think, is quite a powerful image, metaphorically as well as in reality, because that tells us that the moment Zia brought out or harked back to the Hudud ordinances, there was no way forward. I mean, that image of Jinnah would be absolutely forgotten, because you cannot strike out what has been commanded in the Quran or in the religious scriptures. So being a Muslim, being a practicing Muslim, would you be in two minds, or are you at perpetual war when you want to read history that is taking you forward, but at the same time, are you at war because you yourself are a practicing religious person, or you want to be, or your family is conservative? I mean, that's a general question.
Well, I mean, I was going to say...
Sorry about that, but it's a very interesting...
religious Muslim, except unless maybe you went on the beard or something, which is not quite Sharia compliant. No, but, well, a number of points here, Anand. Firstly, I mean, hearing what Dr. Jain had to say and Brother Sai had to say, I think you got the title of this session wrong. I thought we were going to speak about decolonization more broadly, but I think it should have been, why Islam is a threat to the world, because that's what seemed to be coming out. I mean, as Brother Sai very lightly dismissed what he said was my false equivalence between Savarkar, Herzl, and Jinnah. Well, but he didn't respond. Maybe offline, I would be intrigued to hear why he thinks that, and I'm happy to carry this conversation about why Islam in particular is seen as the main focus of this event, of this idea of decolonization. Firstly, I'll come to your points, Anand Bhai. I'll go back to what Dr. Jain was saying earlier. So, I mean, she told this history, as did Brother Sai, about important figures, political figures, rulers, reformist movements. And you can, go back in history teleologically and draw a linear kind of narrative saying that basically such a religion, and you can do it for virtually any religion, right? I mean, there is a history to be told, whether it's Hinduism, even whether it's Sikhism, whether it's Judaism, whether it's Christianity, there is in a way that the history of the world is a history of violence. That is a fact. The holy books that these religions have, whether it's the Gita, the Quran, the Bible, the Torah, the genius of these books are that they are universal books. They talk about universal ideas, and therefore, if you have the intention of going and finding violence in them, you can read Leviticus. I mean, the Gita is about a war. You can go to the Quran, you can find violence. You can find violence in the Torah, in the Old Testament. And on the other hand, if you want to seek something else out, that is also there. And this is where I would rebut Dr. Jain's point. Or rather, I would not rebut, but I would prod her to look at an alternative history too, not just ones of rulers and kings and emperors and philosophers. But, we have Amir Khusro, we have Nizamuddin, we have a huge number, and the Persianate tradition, right? Just to give you one very small example, much before the word secularism even exists, in the 13th century, when people write the history of violence in Islam, Ibn Taymiyyah, this figure in 13th century Damascus, is very important. Most people who are pop specialists of Islam, which unfortunately many are, will know this figure of Ibn Taymiyyah. The same century, you have someone like Fakhruddin Iraqi, who was a poet who was a Sufi, who wrote the following couplet, for instance, right? And I'll recite it to you in Farsi and I'll translate it for you. He says, "Baqamar khana raftam hama pak baz didam shub suma rasidam hama yaftam riyai." Right? He says, I went to the gambling house and all I saw were pure souls. And then I went to the religious ceremony and all I saw were abstaining hypocrites. Now, this is not secularism. This is not humanism, which is rising above Islam. This was a strand in Islam. Maulana Rumi, for instance, who's always painted as a humanist, is a conservative, orthodox, practicing Muslim. He had an alternative idea of tradition that persisted from the early centuries of Islam all the way to the present. So the point is, of course, that across the world, and particularly in South Asia, whether it's the history of Islam or any other religion, you have multiple strands. And you cannot, and if you write a history simply in terms of the outcomes and causes and effects, then you're going to gloss over the voices of the subaltern. You're going to gloss over the voices of women, of Dalits, of Pasmanda Muslims, right? Or who some, I think one of you mentioned them earlier. So I think, you know, this idea has to be complicated, because ultimately, whether it's a Muslim king or a Hindu king, power has its own logic, right? And people who tend to get in power worship at the altar of power.
Sorry to interrupt you, but
you know, they might pay. If I just finish, because you didn't interrupt anyone else, I would object to your interrupting me.
I was about to say, I'm sorry to interrupt you, because I want to ask you to go on, and I was adding a question to you, but anyway,
Yeah.
I take your barb in the right spirit.
No, I just look. You had two questions about
Petition and you speaking.
and you made it personal. Religious. You know, you said whether I'm a practicing Muslim and whether I'm, you know, there's a civil war going inside my mind. No, most certainly not, because there is a story within Islam, a strand within Islam that goes back, that I can relate with, that I have affinity towards. There is an understanding and interpretation of Islam, and I'm very, as personally, able to accommodate difference. Right. The point, I think, the more you know, this. You brought up the hijab issue again. Again, you're looking at, you know, a photograph as a sample size of what reformed or modern Muslims at a certain point look like. I don't think by any stretch of the imagination, as a scientist or as a social scientist, a photograph should really serve as any kind of sample size, you know, speaking as a trained historian. But going back to this question, and you asked a very important question. When we were writing history, can we be neutral? Well, when you are trained in the discipline of history, or for that matter, anthropology or sociology and so on, related disciplines, what you are trained to do as much as possible, and of course, it's not always possible, is to approximate objectivity or get close to it, right? And I'll give you an example, you know, I'll give you a very personal example and you'll understand this, because, and I think it'll appeal perhaps to your audience also. So my family, you know, has had an interesting past. My father was in the Congress party, and I agree with Brother Sai when he says that 70 years, there's been a lot of things that have gone wrong. And of course, the Congress built a lot of the institutions, did a lot of right, but I agree with you that to some extent, there has been a liberal and left conceit, which has not taken into account the fact that this is predominantly a religious country, and therefore spoken to that sense of identity. And therefore, my problem is more with the solution, which is to foist one identity. So my father was in the Congress. My grandfather infamously was in the Muslim League. He was the treasurer of the Muslim League, and he went to Pakistan. I personally absolutely disagree with his politics, right? Now, normally people would have family bias or tribal bias or whatever and would say, no, but it's my grandfather. I completely disagree with his politics. His great-grandfather died fighting the British. The person who died fighting the British in 1857, who was martyred, his great-great-grandfather built temples in the area that I'm in when they were ruling this area, and gave lands for Mafi. Mafi meaning that they didn't have to pay Lagan or tax, right? So here is one family, and we happen to belong to a certain kind of socioeconomic background. And over the course of centuries, I can see various members of my family who I would disagree with, some who I would agree with. And it is my duty as someone who is trying to be objective, trying to be, in a sense, true to my training, true to myself as a human being, to not simply fall for prejudice, right? Simply because I share ethnicity, religion, race, caste, nationality with someone doesn't mean that I am necessarily going to agree with everything they say. Coming back to the wider point, right? If we move beyond just Islam, I think the point, you know, the fundamental point that we have to understand is if we are going to fixate on Islam simply as the cause of all the ills of the subcontinent and of the world, then my hypothetical continues to work. And I ask you the question, you know, who, once you build a state or build a country on the basis of any religion X, there will naturally be a tussle, and it is happening in Israel today. It was built in the name of Zionism. Today, there is a very active debate within Zionists about what a modern Jewish state should look like. So, you know, I came to this debate thinking actually it's a much more broader debate than a broadside attack on Islam.
I think in all honesty, no, Ali, now you must let me come in, because I think I've given you more time than either Meenakshi or J Sai. I don't think it's about Islam. I don't think we've managed to give anyone any room for playing the victim here. I think we're just talking religion. And in fact, one of the questions, if I can come back to, and I will come back to you, Ali, because I will charge you with, when you talk about bringing in objectivity, the question that when you talk of objectivity and at the same time, how can you then, not you personally, but how can people eulogize Aurangzeb or Tipu Sultan or Churchill, for that matter, who directly killed 4.4 million Bengalis and was responsible for, chemical warfare? How can you then eulogize Mao, who is on currency notes in China, who directly killed 63 million of his own people? And how can you eulogize a lot of people in history if you were to look at their, what good deeds they did, but at the same time ignore their crimes? Why don't you do the same for Hitler? Why don't you do the same for, I don't know, King Leopold or a lot of other people? So I don't think there is this sense of being objective when there is agenda that seeps in amongst not only the writers of history, but readers of history. But to come back to this question that Ali didn't answer, but I asked Meenakshi ji, is that shouldn't religion also be included when we talk of decolonizing?
Absolutely. Because,
yeah, and I think that's very important. That's why I think Ali possibly took umbrage to us discussing Islam. I mean, it was in that context of should Islam, should Hinduism, should Judaism. I mean, for example, I'll give you one example when we talk of history. It wasn't till last year when I read Sanjeev Sanyal's book and True Indology spoke about it, that I knew or got to know that Ashoka was already a Buddhist 8 years before he went into the Kalinga war and killed hundreds of thousands.
Yes.
We haven't been taught that. What we've been taught is that he became a Buddhist after he saw all that wanton destruction in Kalinga. Now that to me is so cataclysmic to my psyche. What have people hidden from me? And that seems to me directly a result of being colonized by, or being politically correct and not telling us the truth. So to what extent is decolonizing, and as I say, history that is written by the victors is peddled by the vanquished. And it seems to me when we talk of our historians or Marxist historians, they have hidden so much. And when Ali talked about that, Marxist historians have ignored how religious this country is. I mean, the insinuation was that they have ignored the Hindu psyche of this country. I disagree with that. I think Marxist historians, even if they have ignored the Hindu psyche of the country, they have also ignored the crimes committed by people who belong to other religions, maybe Christianity or Islam, Abrahamic. So it's like saying that we are going to tell you wrong information. In addition to that, we are not going to tell you the right information. So it's a two-pronged attack. Meenakshi ji, your views on that?
You see, this whole problem of decolonizing, it is very, very vividly captured in our school textbooks. This whole controversy is because of a particular point of view that has been projected by left historians who wrote the textbooks from class 6 to class 11. So most students don't take up history in college. So that means that the history that they are taught and that remains with them is the history that they learn through the NCERT textbooks. Now these NCERT textbooks, they were written by left historians, well-known historians, and when they faced public censure, then a new group of left historians came in. This time they were not individual authors, they were the entire faculty almost of JNU. So this is as far as the textbooks is concerned. Now, what is the defining feature of these textbooks? It is to present Indian society as a casteist society with religions or panths or sampradayas always at war. Whereas, when you start studying history of the ancient period...
Sorry to interrupt you, Meenakshi. That's very interesting you're saying. So you're saying that Marxist historians haven't hidden the so-called, if I can put it, the crimes of Hinduism or Hindu religion. They have kind of,
overblown it.
Overblown it.
Yes.
But at the same time, they haven't talked about the reforms that have happened. So, for example, when we talk of reforms in any religion, we kind of ignore the fact that reforms in Islam have not been accepted in India, but you have the Hindu Code Bill that has been accepted.
Yes. And then, apart from that, when you come to the medieval period, then there is an attempt to not mention even the Arab and Turkish invasions. Now, obviously, we're not saying that the sins of the past are to be visited on the present. That's not our point of view. But the extent of distortion you can understand by the fact that the class 7 textbook, it talks about Mahmud Ghaznavi in the same paragraph as Raja Raja Chola. Now, when the student has not been taught about any invasions of the Arabs or Turks, and Raja Raja Chola is just discussed in the same paragraphs as Mahmud Ghaznavi, how is he to know what was the role of Mahmud Ghaznavi in the Indian psyche? You know, Mahmud Ghaznavi played a very important role. It's not a question of just emphasizing Islam. The point that we must remember is that in the medieval period, it was not the first time that India was invaded. Parts of northwestern India were ruled by Bactrian Greeks, Shakas, Kushans, and even Huns.
So let me, this very interesting thought, because let me ask this to Sai, and then I will come to Ali and ask the same question. Babur, of course, is universally thought of as an invader because he was. But Sai, at what point did the Mughal scions, in your assessment, stopped being invaders and started being Indians, or do you consider even Aurangzeb as an invader?
Never.
Never.
Did they ever treat themselves as that? And I'll just give you an example. So
yes.
There's an important point that Dr. Ali made which needs to be responded to. His point was, why did we veer towards Islam? The point is, in his opening submissions, Dr. Ali made the point that this aspect of decolonization must be limited only to the British period. Whereas I am saying, I'm sorry, that is the typical Orientalist approach where you treat Hindus and Muslims as equal victims of British colonization, whereas according to us, it has to go much beyond that because it's been even worse. Okay. Second, the problem is Indian history, as Dr. Jain has pointed out, has been looked at from the perspective of an Abrahamic Marxist approach, which is to say, just as if we were to be left to ourselves, we will kill each other in the name of purity. That's exactly what Hindus did before the Muslims or the Christians arrived. And that's exactly what will happen in a future counterfactual or a hypothetical situation where if this country were to be deprived of all its Muslims and Christians, this is exactly what you guys would be doing. Then the problem is, you've equated the fundamental nature of Hinduism with other two faiths, which is not the case. Which is to say, assume for a moment that two sampradayas disagree with each other and they have a certain view with respect to the supreme consciousness. At this they will say, I don't subscribe to you, and both of these schools would preach to their respective followers, so to speak. But they wouldn't go about issuing fatwas to each other saying, he is not a true Hindu, finish him off. In Udupi, I was shown a recent picture, this is of 2021, there is a tea stall owned by a Barelvi who says, Deobandis and dogs are not allowed. This is within the same community, okay? Please show me any Vaishnavite saying this against Shaivite or whatever it is. There's a school of thought which has basically said, before we arrived, this is what you did, you destroyed each other's temples. No, they would take the gods away because for them these were aspects of worship and prestige, and therefore I want it in my kingdom and I will go and establish a new temple. So Dr. Faizan Mustafa
So decolonizing for you goes beyond
100%
British decolonization, and of course by definition beyond what the Marxists have interpreted.
I'll just make one point.
Sure,
question, I'll respond to your actual question, which is, at what point does an invader become an Indian?
Yeah.
If you had truly allowed the Hindu accretions to become part of Islam and had this mythical creature called Ganga Jamni Tehzeeb actually existed, then perhaps a case could have been made. Shah Waliullah Dalavi was in 1760s, and he has written a letter specifically saying, I am a foreigner and I subscribe to the mores of the Arabs. And by that he does not mean pre-Islamic Arabs, he speaks of the Arabs around the period of the Prophet, which is why his movement was called Tariqa-e-Muhammadiyah. Okay? This is in 1760s, after close to 600 years of so-called desecration. Now, we speak of Akbar on a regular basis, and he is supposed to be the paragon of this Ganga Jamuni Tehzeeb and the syncretic culture. The guru, so to speak, or let's not use the word guru, that's too sacred a term to be used here. The predecessor, the spiritual predecessor for Dehlavi was Ahmad Sirhindi, who lived in the time of Akbar, who was the first one to start what is known as the Mujaddidiya order. By the way, since we've been told how great Sufi orders are, Dehlavi was a Naqshbandi and Mujaddidiya Sufi. All these people were Sufis, who basically said, the right form of Sufism is that form of Sufism that subscribes to only two pillars of Islam, namely Quran and Hadith. All other accretions, namely Shia, Arab, which is pre-Islamic Arab, Hindu accretions and Roman accretions cannot enter. And since Dr. Ali mentioned Ibn Taymiyyah, let me just, since I don't have the insinuation about pop culture and all people who understand, who speak of Islam, Ibn Taymiyyah belongs to what is known as the Hanbali school of thought between the 9th and 13th century. That school of thought, why did it arise? Mongol invasions had taken place in the Middle East. Effectively, Syria, Damascus was under the control, the Al-Sham or the Levant was under the control of the Mongols. Why is Ibn Taymiyyah so important to Islamic history? He was the first one to issue the fatwa, at least he is the most prominent one to basically say, if a Muslim ruler does not live by the Quran and the Hadith, jihad can be waged even against a Muslim ruler, because until then the belief was jihad was not to be used against Muslim rulers.
In fact, Tipu said so. Tipu's own manifesto says
exactly.
This. If a Muslim ruler is siding with the Hindu, he also becomes.
He has to become. You have to treat them as what they call the mushrikeen.
Yeah.
That's the word they invented. Yeah. So therefore, this is not the, let's say, a quest for purity. This is a quest for dealing with existential problems that are in the current. If that mentality continues to be present today, I have a right to explore the past and find out what are its antecedents and origins.
Right.
So this is not an academic exercise.
Yes, so absolutely. And now, Ali, you will have all the time. In fact, we have about 6 minutes left, so I'll give you half of that. Please don't say I'm not going to give you time. I am. I think we have finally settled on what the nub of the issue is. That for me, and I would say for Meenakshi ji and J Sai as well, is to expand this definition of decolonizing and to not restrict it to the last 200 years or certainly not to the last 50 years when our textbooks have been written, even though we are an independent nation, but to take it back further and further and further. J Sai and Meenakshi ji have taken it back to the 14th or the 15th century. I have further up to when religions were invented. And I'm not just talking of Islam or any other, all religions. And I believe that is the decolonizing that we need to do. So 2 questions to you. When you accuse is a very strong word, but maybe in jest you talked about we are only talking about Islam. We really weren't. And if we were, it was possibly intentional, no, unintentional, because the history of India is intertwined with the history of, Islamic invaders and so on and so forth. It's nothing to be, wary of when we're discussing that. Point number 2 is when you're expanding it to include religions, then Islam obviously would come in per se. But other than your view on should we or should we not expand this definition of decolonizing, would you like to answer or disagree with J Sai when I asked him that question pinpointedly? At what point did going down, descending from Babur downwards, did the Mughals stop being invaders and started being Indians? Or do you believe that, yes, like Sai, they were always invaders?
To answer that question, I think the first thing I would say is how do we define the idea of India? India as a nation state is a young country. India as a civilization is a much, of course, older concept, but no one group has a monopoly over that idea. So the idea of whether any of the Mughals were Indian or not Indian can be debated, and I'm open to that debate. I don't think we're here to sit about medieval history in particular and argue about whether Aurangzeb, who was brought up was cruel or not, as you said, Anand bhai, in your comments. I mean, look, I would say Aurangzeb was a ruler, in my opinion, not a good Muslim. Look at the way he treated his brother and his Dara Shikoh and his father. And he, much like most other rulers, he also worked with the logic of power. Just a quick, incidentally, also earlier, I didn't ignore your question. My own, I recited that couplet for you in Persian. My own belief is that the process of reform has always been there. There's the problem, for example, within Muslims and Muslim society is that that story has not been told because it is a history of power that has mostly been perpetuated also by the Muslims. There are alternative histories. The Naqshbandi order, the Mujaddadi order are particular orders. There are many, there are Qadris, Chishtis, Shadalis. I mean, there's so many orders, not all of them violent. Many of them, of course, did rise up as Sufi orders at the time of colonization in the 19th century. That is a separate debate, and we can't teleologically link that to something intrinsically violent about Sufi orders. A little correction. The Hanbali school didn't arise because of the Mongol invasions. The Hanbali school, which is named after Ahmad ibn Hanbal, started in the 8th century. He was persecuted by the Abbasid caliphs. And much before that, there were debates within Muslims between the Asharis and the Mu'tazilis. I mean, the process of reform, I believe in any tradition, right, has been an ongoing process. So I don't think it is necessary, this idea that superiority that we feel,
I'm terribly sorry, but we've been told we have 1.5 minutes left. So I'm going to give you 1 minute out of the 1.5. And if you could sum up the fact that do we really need to expand this definition of decolonizing?
Look, I mean, just to make the final point, I don't think historians are there to eulogize anyone. Going back to your point about Mao, Aurangzeb, Babur, or anyone for that matter. People eulogize and they are taught a history, they are conditioned. And often the modern device that is used for conditioning is nationalism. I don't think the process of reform is ongoing. We need to excavate that story. And lastly, every civilization philosophically others people, right? Whether it's the Abrahamic religions, kept hearing the word kafir, but even in the Hindu tradition, the varnas and the jatis and so on. And you have the idea of the mlechas who have no caste, or the Dalits who have no caste. And in the era of the nation state, the kafir of the nation state is the traitor. So philosophically, human beings have been unable to come up with an ideology in which they don't base their identity in antagonism to that which is not, right? That is something fundamental to human beings. And I think all we can do is to try and not define ourselves in antagonism to someone else or something else, and try and actually confirm and affirm our own humanity.
Final words from Meenakshi ji and J Sai. Should we expand the definition of decolonizing?
Absolutely,
going back?
absolutely.
How far would you go back?
We have to go at least 1,000 years ago.
1,000 years.
Yes.
What about you, J Sai?
Because the problems of the past remain in the present.
Right.
They have not gone away.
Yeah.
And I don't know of any school within Islam that has propagated living peacefully with the non-Muslim population.
Yeah. And incidentally, when Ali talked of reform, I mean, we have Ahmadiyya sect,
Yes.
3.5 million population in Pakistan, and Pakistan has outlawed Ahmadiyya.
Yes.
In fact, even AIMIM in India, a political party, does not recognize Ahmadiyyas as Muslims. So,
Just two concluding remarks.
Yeah, sure.
One, predictably, Dr. Ali did not respond to your question of whether the question of decolonization should even include the Muslim period or the Muslim invasions. I leave it at that. Second, what Dr. Ali doesn't point out is that Islamic reformation has always moved towards greater call for Islamic purity. And that is exactly why otherization is an integral process of Islamic reform movements. Document by document by document, I can show this. So therefore, when he speaks of reform, while it seems to have a benign connotation, benign in Islam effectively means go back to the basics and therefore live in accordance with what was the practice around the period of its founding. And therefore, whether it is translated to peaceful times for non-Muslims, I think we will only decide that on the basis of conduct, not on the basis of intent alone.
Right. So when we talk in scientific terms, when we talk of evolution, in this case, when the reform is harking back to the founding principles, it is, I don't know, devolution or going back, I don't know what the thing is. But we've had a wonderful discussion. Thank you so much, Dr. Ali Khan, J Sai and Meenakshi Ji. It's been a real pleasure to be moderating it. I once again thank you so much to all three of you and to our listeners and to the organizers of Arth. Thank you so much.
Kojo.